Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. Keir Starmer has now become the first British Prime Minister to visit China in 8 years. He met both President Xi Jinping and Premier Qiang, calling China a vital player on a global scale, with whom the UK was seeking a more sophisticated relationship. For his part, President Xi called on China and the UK to jointly advocate and practice true multilateralism. But what does all that really tell us about the relationship between the UK and China? I'm joined now by Professor Kerry, Director of the Lao-China Institute at King's College London, Professor Michael Zeng, Department of Public and International Affairs at City University of Hong Kong, and here with me in the studio is Stephen Lynch, the Director of the British Chamber of Commerce. Great to have such a strong panel on the agenda. Welcome, everyone. Kerry, let me start with you, because on the way to Beijing, Starmer called China a vital player on a global scale and talked about this sophisticated relationship that could develop. What do you think he meant by that, and has he achieved it?
So the very specific thing about this meeting is it happens when the United States is very unpredictable, and there's been recent issues over President Trump making claims over Greenland and questions about NATO. These are unprecedented. This has not happened, certainly in living memory. So I think that kind of overshadows this visit and means that for very different reasons, Britain and China are trying to think through the implications of this. I mean, obviously, Britain, very close security ally of the United States, member of the P5 on the UN Security Council, member of NATO. I mean, China is a member of the P5, not a member of NATO, and so is a different security actor, very different security actor. But for both, the unpredictability in the global environment means that they're rethinking their relationship and they're rethinking the dynamics of it and trying to kind of find ways of allying where they can and accepting that there are going to be differences which are long-standing and which both sides know well.
Michael, that's something that President Xi acknowledged too, isn't it? He talked about the relationship between the UK and China having these twists and turns, but added that China really stood ready to develop a long-term and consistent strategic partnership with the UK. Do you think that he's positioning China as a beacon of stability compared to the unpredictability of the current White House administration?
Yes, I think that message was very deliberate. By stressing long-term and consistency, Beijing is constructing its approach with what it framed as policy volatility in Washington. So China wants to present itself as a predictable partner, particularly to European countries, even if that narrative does not always match how others experience Chinese policy in practice. But I think it's also very important to know, especially in the UK-China context, there is a lot of changes in the UK side as well. If you go back to 2015, the Conservative Party has been hailing a golden era during Xi Jinping's visit to the UK. And ever since then, we have seen a free fall of UK-China relations after Brexit and rapid change of leadership in the UK. And from 2015 to now, basically there were 6 prime ministers. And you see very different views on China and debate. So from the golden era to anything but golden era in Rishi Sunak's term, and to Ice Age in Keir Starmer's term. So I think when China talk about a long-term and consistent strategic partnership, it's also referring to the hope that the UK would have a more stable and consistent approach towards China, so they can build a stronger partnership.
So a clear diplomatic piece here, but Stephen, let's talk about the business element, because there's been a flurry of trade deals, but I wonder, in economic terms, do they really make a difference? Do they really push the dial? I mean, does the UK need China more than China needs the UK?
So I think this trip means different things to different people. We can see that being played out in the media right now. This is not groundbreaking in regards to the trade that's going to come out from this. We don't see enormous headline deals, but I think it brings us back to the priority of this trip. Number one is around engagement or re-engagement at the highest level of diplomacy. And then second is that piece around economic security and the deals that we're discussing here. And I will say that, you know, sitting here in London, engagement does not mean naivety, but engagement without these capabilities, especially around business, are genuinely dangerous. Disengagement without any form of strategy is just impossible. It's not a credible strategy. So this visit is really about stabilisation. I think that is the core to this, sort of rebalancing and readdressing some of these strategic dialogues, which are really important to move forward. And anyone who's worked in China, with China, around business will understand that this is around sequencing as well. This stabilisation at the highest level of diplomacy is important to create the frameworks, to create the security for future engagement. So I think we're done on the deals as we sit here today, but I do expect moving forward, we might have larger investments into the UK if we're talking about electrical vehicles, life sciences, on the back of this visit. So looking at the binary, does the UK need China or does China need the UK? I don't think that's particularly helpful. It's about we need each other, and that's around economic security and actually resilience in the relationship.
But are you saying the deals that have been done, for example, on whiskey, it's just symbolic, it's tokenism?
Well, I mean, whiskey is, out of all the deals, really symbolic, because you can hold it, you can feel it, you can drink it, obviously. And why is it so symbolic and so well known? The reason why whiskey is so well known around the world is because 90% of Scotch whiskey is exported. So any form of little tariff or blockage has enormous impact on the industry. What we've always called for from the Chinese side is to go further and faster on some of these market access barriers, which will have a big impact on their economy, as well as sort of UK exports and opportunities. And the big one around that is services. We can see that from the delegation, huge financial professional service delegation. Services is our biggest opportunity when we're talking about relationships with China.
President Xi also called on the two countries to advocate for genuine multilateralism and a more just and reasonable governance system, noting that unilateralism and power politics have really impacted the international order. So how do you see that all playing out?
Well, I think all countries now are having to rethink the international architecture. The post-World War order is disappearing, if not many places disappeared. I mean, the White House now, we have Trump this time round even more kind of unilateralist in America's behavior than before. Right? I mean, kind of invading Venezuela, threatening to, kind of do things around Greenland, as I said earlier. So we have to really think differently. That's obvious. And how we do that, we won't ever be able, as the UK, to pretend our security relationship with the United States isn't extremely important. I mean, it is crucial. But we also have viable and legitimate kind of bilateral issues, usually economic. I mean, Steve just mentioned financial services. Yeah, I mean, Britain's economy is incredibly, kind of strong in financial services. But I think for this visit, kind of the most important thing to recognize, even in the 8 years since the last prime ministerial visit, is the fact that China is now a technology superpower. I mean, all the data shows that in many areas of research and development, it's just drawn way ahead. And that changes everything else. I mean, we don't kind of really have a very neat division between, your kind of security interests and your economic interests. And it's very kind of, you can silo things. What we have now is the fact that China is producing for environment, for life sciences, for pharma, for AI, critically important technology, and that's likely to increase into the future. And we have to work out what the UK kind of does about that. How do we engage with China? So I think this visit, beyond all of the sort of traditional geopolitical issues and the changes there, is also recognizing this massive, massive sort of paradigm change that's happening in terms of knowledge production, who does it and how they do it, and China figures in that massively.
We're nodding along with you here in the studio. But Michael, clearly then a very important visit for the UK. How important was the UK's visit to China?
I think it was important for China, but in a slightly different way. So for Beijing, the visit was less about the immediate economic deals, as previous speaker has been talking about. But to Beijing, I think it's more about signaling stability and normalization in China's relation with a major Western power at a time of strained ties with the US and parts of Europe. Being able to engage with the UK really helps China to show it still have rooms for pragmatic diplomacy. And in the UK-China bilateral context, I think China would like to say, there is no prime minister visited China for 80 years. And now this is signaling back towards the old golden era, although it's still very different kind of bilateral relation. But it's I think China will very much welcome to see a UK that is more pragmatic regarding its relation with China. And also UK now joining a group of Western countries that start to rethink about China and getting closer to China. So all are very good strategic signals to China and also for China to showcase its global image.
Stephen, let's talk a bit more about the business trajectory you talked about, because Keir Starmer went out to Beijing with a big UK business delegation. I think there were 50 companies with him, including AstraZeneca, who's announced this deal, $15 billion worth of investment in China. Is this something we're going to hear more about now from UK companies?
So I would say the deals from the visit have sort of been secured. I think the announcements are clear, and the AstraZeneca one is important. That investment probably would have continued regardless of the Prime Minister's visit, but it's probably shifted that over the line. I think it's looking at the relationship from a slightly different perspective, and I think that business-to-business relationship has always remained relatively robust. China's still our third largest trading partner. If you add on Hong Kong, sort of 120, 130 billion pounds of bilateral investment in the relationship. The big businesses have been there 50, 60 years. They might still be there in 50, 60 years. They're not optimistic about this visit. They're not negative about this visit. They're a bit more nuanced. I think what it does call into question is previous prime ministers have essentially grappled with the exact same issue. How do we balance our national security with prosperity and engagement? And we've seen different versions of that from Cameron right the way through to Sunak. And I think we're currently set with compete, challenge, cooperate. I think this visit would add a fourth C to that, which is clarity. It gives us a little bit more clarity around the relationship, the trajectory moving forward, which is really important. The challenge is, what does that mean for small businesses, medium businesses? They are still slightly flying blind on this issue. So the big guys, they understand, they're on the plane. But actually, a lot of businesses, a lot of civil society want to know, is China an opportunity or is it a risk? And I think that's the bit that we need clarity.
All kinds of areas were discussed, from education to healthcare, finance to AI, and of course, the green transition. Which sectors do you see that real immediate progress following this visit? I mean, where is what Qiang called China's new engine for innovative development?
Well, I think there were several areas that potentially the UK and China can explore. I think and also depends on the UK's priorities. I think, for example, in clean energy, green energy, electric, EV, I think those were the kind of area that stands out. Not only China has the skill and experience, but also the comparative costs. And some other area, I think when China engages with the UK, probably needs to think more through. I think, for example, more advanced manufacturing is an area, but I think there are some kind of domestic debate that we think the UK needs to working out, and also relevant to the large-scale infrastructure as well, can be still a very kind of sensitive issue for the UK to figure out what kind of Chinese investment they would like to accept.
Kerry, I saw you were itching to jump in there. I mean, I wonder if you see the UK positioning itself as a bridge, maybe, between China and other Western economies. I mean, do you think that's how Starmer and indeed British business leaders are looking at this visit?
Well, I think we're looking after ourselves at the moment. Everyone else is. I mean, Trump is going to be going to China he's going to be meeting Xi in April, reportedly. So, I mean, and despite the fact that he was very critical of Britain and China's sort of the visit today when he was asked by reporters in America. I mean, we have to kind of accept that now we're living in a world where bilateral is the sort of the way things are at the moment. We just have to be quite transactional. I mean, I wanted to say, I mean, to Steve's point, and when you're talking about these deals, I mean, as a university, King's College in London, we have to accept in our sector, China's incredibly important for two reasons. One, very large numbers still of Chinese students come to Britain. That's very important. So they're a kind of bridge, and they're very unique to Britain. Only America and Australia have similar numbers of Chinese students. And the second is that for the UK, although we never really get this acknowledged much, China is our second largest research partner. I mean, America is still the largest, but in terms of peer-reviewed papers, I think 16,000, last time it was calculated about 3 or 4 years ago, 16,000 papers are issued with British and Chinese collaborators. I mean, in areas like cancer treatment, in areas like environmental science and quantum computing, I mean, it's not that we don't work. We work a lot, but it's not really kind of given the priority it should. largely because people just do it people to people level. They don't really kind of tend to involve, kind of more kind of government areas, but also because I think that there's never really been this sort of more balanced dialogue about China in Britain. It's been quite fractious and difficult. As someone who works in this area, all the time, I have found it sometimes difficult to try and get a kind of moderate and more kind of pragmatic tone in the sort of general discussion. I hope this visit creates a bit more knowledge about the Chinese possibilities, and practically just finally, the visa-free access is a great thing. The fact when it finally is implemented, that British people for 30 days will be able to go visa-free to China. There's not enough people going at the moment. I mean, whatever you think, people should have the opportunity to go and just see with their own eyes and make their own conclusions. And hopefully this will encourage that.
So Kerry, these people-to-people exchanges, the importance of soft connections between the two countries, education, tourism, cultural connections. You're saying that this visit has really highlighted the importance of that and maybe pushed it forward?
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing about our relationship, Britain and China, is we've known each other for a long time. So there's lots of links, people-to-people links, even when there were, much tougher times than today, 50, 60 years ago in the Cold War, we still maintained links. Okay. Second thing is that actually on big issues like AI, like environment, like public health and sustainability and things like this, Britain and China don't disagree. I mean, it's not like we're arguing about fundamental things. Yes, we have very different views about, kind of values issues. We have different views about political systems. We know that. We've talked about that a lot. There's a framework. I mean, the president of China, Xi Jinping, did say it's been an up and down relationship. I think our prime minister would obviously agree with that. But, those things, I think, are largely where we are in agreement. And finally, people-to-people contact is still pretty good. I mean, there's still very kind of, positive views about Chinese culture in Britain. There's interest in Chinese sort of gaming online. There's sort of things that British people, whether they whatever they think of China itself, they're interested. These are all positive things. This is not a kind of a scenario where you should, by default, be pessimistic.
Keir Starmer said it would be foolhardy not to engage with China. This visit really has been seen as part of a much wider opening up for British businesses in China. You talked about the challenges you think still remain, but how far do you think it succeeded in that endeavour?
I think, again, it goes back down to the priorities, right? This is around engagement and setting up the frameworks, the strategic dialogues to move forward. But I'd really like to pick up on Kerry's point, vehemently agree with him, but also challenge it in a slightly different way. That the relationship is built up upon different things: government, business, and these people-to-people. That's absolutely foundational. If we look at the people-to-people relationship, this cultural exchange, it's so important. To mention, there's around 200,000 Chinese students right here in the UK studying right now, about 1 million graduates back in China. There is currently 300 British students in China right now studying. I'm going to show my age here. I went to China when I was 22. I was a young professional. I was supposed to be there for 6 months. I stayed for close to 12 years. Almost every single person, a business leader, former ambassadors, they did similar. This cultural exchange, is business to business, people exchange is so important. The numbers of foreign nationals, British nationals in China is dropping. That's not good for the relationship. We can't build if we can't speak the same language. We can't build if we're not in the same country. So moving forward, I hope this foundationally sets up an understanding that if we need to work with China, all those 4 C's that I've just mentioned, the people-to-people needs to be foundational. We need to improve that dialogue, that engagement, and that starts with education back here as well. We need to be able to speak the same language, understand their culture, understand that they have a very different set of values, but different doesn't mean wrong, it means different. And I think that starts from that people-to-people connection. So I would agree with Kerry, this people-to-people cultural exchange is very, very important.
So education is super important, but long-term investment too. And Michael, the UK is actively seeking that to support growth, to support regional development. Where do you think that Chinese capital and expertise play a particularly constructive role? Is it in infrastructure? Is it in advanced manufacturing, clean technology, something else? All of those things, Michael.
I think at this stage in time, I think it's important to probably look into those low risky and those clear or more aligned with the British priorities. then that would mean previously, as I mentioned, clean energy, green energy, EV probably are the area to start with because China do have the skill and the expertise, and also potentially advanced manufacturing and where it's possible to create jobs in the UK region. But large-scale infrastructure, I think it's quite more sensitive because there's a lot to think about. And also, I really want to mention that I agree with Kerry and Steve on the importance of education and also people-to-people exchange. Because previously, I was directing a Confucius Institute in the UK for about 6 years' time. And it was a very challenging period. And I think now being able to have a British Prime Minister to visit China and signaling about the UK's more pragmatic approach towards China is very important for people to do people-to-people exchange and also cultural exchange, and also showing a more inclusive environment for Chinese students to go to the UK. I was a Chinese student going to the UK, studying at Warwick back in 2012, and the environment was very different in the past 6 years' time. A lot of Chinese students do not feel they are very much welcomed. They are not so welcomed in British society. And I think now when Keir Starmer are trying to signal a very different approach towards China, I think it's very important for the government to do what they can to create more inclusive environment for the Chinese students there.
Kerry, I want to talk a little bit more about the shifting world order. I mean, do you think there's a sense that middle powers, including the UK, are seeking greater strategic autonomy and that engagement with China is going to become part of that broader trend?
I think they haven't much choice. I mean, the things that have happened recently, I think, have shocked people. It's been building up over the last year. I mean, the American Vice President J.D. Vance in Munich last year at the Security Conference said, well, why don't you Europeans think? But I think we now are thinking. We've usually made big assumptions about where our principal alliances should belong. I don't think we can pretend that we are going to suddenly shift from one side to the other, but we definitely have to recognize complexity. And I mean, China has never been for Britain, a very straightforward partner. We have big differences. That's obvious. But I think that we definitely have lots of ways in which we can overcome that. The thing that Steve said about the number of British students in China, I think that's really critical because we need to have knowledge of China. I mean, Chinese are very knowledgeable now. Many have traveled and lived abroad. We need to reciprocate. We need to be more open-minded. I think whatever the new geopolitical order, it's clearly going to need a lot of acceptance that there are new powers rising, China, India. I mean, what was called the global south. I mean, their significance is something we can't deny. It's a good thing that the world is seeing this great, kind of growth of rising of nations that, were not developed before. That's fantastic. We just have to factor that into our thinking. And I think a lot of political figures in Britain maybe don't really understand the thing I talked about earlier, China's technology development. I mean, they're talking about 10 years behind the time, like we're protecting what we have from China taking it. I mean, now China has the things that we're interested in. And obviously this visit gives an opportunity to try and think of legitimate access to that.
Stephen, Kerry just mentioned India. It's making me think about global trade, because Starmer's the latest in a long list of European leaders who've headed to China. Yeah. Do you think that improved China-UK ties can actually strengthen the UK's global trading position? I mean, whether with the US, whether with India, with the EU, but by giving it maybe more options at the table, or given Donald Trump's warning, could it actually create more issues?
So, again, I think the key to this visit, and in light of what everything Kerry just mentioned there, is this is around diversification. And diversification gives you options, then options can give you leverage. But the other thing to understand about China's role in the world, and we have to understand it in the context of this visit, is 1 in 8 people live in the global West, 7 in 8 don't. 7 billion people on this planet interact China very differently to how we think they should. So they see them as a stable partner right now, and I think that's really, really critical, that working with China doesn't weaken our alliances. We need to understand where China sits geopolitically, where we sit geopolitically right now, and where the US sits geopolitically. As Kerry mentioned, I don't think any country can be over-dependent on a market anymore, or over-dependent on a specific industry at such instability and geopolitical instability. So, the question is often asked, choose between the US or China. In so many ways we already have. But it's sector by sector and issue by issue. So national security, we're completely aligned with the US. But to Michael and to Kerry's point, green economy, advanced manufacturing, supply chains, artificial intelligence, its dependency is now towards China. So I think, we've got to think about our role in the world in regards to we are a middling power, if we want to call it, in the words of Mark Carney, and giving ourselves that options, that diversification is really important right now when there's such geopolitical instability and risk.
This weekend is 5 years since the UK officially left the European Union. Does Brexit play into this forging closer ties between the UK and China?
So we're resetting our relationship with the EU. That's been quite clear. Five years on. I think the big challenge that the UK and indeed Europe is grappling with is around economic security, what that means. So we're a serviced economy, but if you look at Germany, they're a manufacturing economy. So I think as Europe, we need to think, what's our role as this bloc? What does it mean? What does that mean around economic security, national security, and actually how we work together? And is that a pivot towards China? Is that a pivot towards the US? Or actually, is it resilience within that continent? And I think that is what European leaders are grappling with right now. That's why European leaders have been in a rotational door to China as well.
Michael, the meetings have been had, the hands have been shaken. What needs to happen now to turn this talk into action from both China and from the UK to really reset this relationship?
I think the key now is really to follow through. On the UK side, I think that probably would mean giving the business a more clear signal about what is permitted to do and what is off limits, so investment won't get stuck in political uncertainty. And in the past 10 years, what has been really happening is the business wasn't give a very clear instruction of what kind of collaboration with China is okay or isn't. And if we refer back to the university example, as Kerry mentioned, a lot of universities, they have different kind of research partnership with China, but it wasn't very clear to what extent those are okay and those are not okay, especially when it comes to scientific collaboration in AI and in other areas. So I think giving that clear signal about what is permitted and what isn't will be very helpful. But I think the thing here is the UK government in the past 10 years haven't really been clear about its approach towards China. So that significantly restricts its ability to give that clear signal. And on the Chinese side, I think it would mean delivering concrete projects and showing greater transparency and predictability. Without that, the momentum from the visit will fade away very quickly. But I think giving this visa-free condition is a good starting point.
Kerry, what do you think? Do you agree? Where do you think we're headed?
Yeah, I think that it's obviously on a more pragmatic kind of track. I mean, it does depend on delivery, though. I mean, we've had many occasions in the past where there were high-level visits, they went well, then afterwards the follow-up wasn't great. So I really hope this time the follow-up is good. A lot of it is dictated by necessity. I mean, Britain's economy is not doing great. I mean, kind of very sluggish sort of growth. If at all, productivity remains perpetually a problem. So I think if people, like the Prime Minister said, the cost of living and things like that, if they see this relationship giving things in terms of job creating investments and things like that, then we will build up momentum.
Kerry Brown, Michael Zeng, Stephen Lynch, thank you all very much indeed. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.